This is really one of my favorite parts, actually the favorite part of the evening, except for I like the kids and I like the teachers, so that's all good. But anyway, this is our Fireside chat with this year's Visionary Award winners. Please join me as I introduce you to our first honoree of this evening, Thasunda Brown Duckett, the President and CEO of TIAA. Thank you very much. Okay. This is like a really long and impressive resume here, so just everybody relax for a minute. Before moving to TIAA, Thasunda was the CEO of Chase Consumer Banking, which followed upon her being CEO of Chase Auto Finance and National Retail Sales, which followed upon her being Director of Emerging Markets at Fannie Mae, where she implemented national strategies to increase home ownership among Black and Hispanic Americans. Period. Wow. Good stuff. Thasunda is most often referred to as powerful, the most powerful woman in finance, the most powerful African-American business leader, but this entirely fails to speak to who she really is, to her wisdom, her personal warmth, her commitment to people, all qualities that are unexpected in the powerful and yet very welcome. Thasunda is dedicated to bringing financial health to people from all walks of life and to closing the achievement gaps in wealth creation and career success for communities of color. To that end, she established a foundation in her parents' names, the Otis and Rosie Brown Foundation, to recognize and reward people who use ordinary means to empower and uplift their community in extraordinary ways. I think we're going to be talking about that a little bit. Thasunda herself transforms all of these qualities of great leadership in our industry into light. And it is truly an honor to welcome the leader who said, "We are all agents of the art of possibility." Thanks so much. Yep. That was a mic drop. All right, thank you. I don't need that. I got this and I got that. I got all kinds of mics going on here. Okay, our next honoree, Claudia Goldin, is the Henry Lee Professor of Economics at Harvard University. And this is super cool because we're going to have a good discussion here with this because Claudia is the first woman offered tenure in the Harvard Economics Department. When she was getting her PhD from the University of Chicago, she participated in a study of the economic aftermath of the Civil War in the South. This took her to several southern states to visit archives. She hitched from town to town and stayed with the archivists in their homes. She had no idea that she was actually expected to have travel expenses and stay in hotels, for which she would have been reimbursed. Not Claudia, she's the economical economist. In her long career at Harvard, Claudia excavated what was missing from economic history, the presence of women in the labor force. Of her many forays into this and related topics, her recently published book, Career and Family, Women's Century-Long Journey Toward Equity, is the highly regarded culmination. She's well regarded for her dedication in shepherding her graduate students forward in this field. In 2014, Claudia started the Undergraduate Women in Economics program to encourage more female economics majors. Her curiosity, her undaunted application, her perception have added enormous depth, some would say joy, to her research and to her students. And just a note, I love macro history, and Claudia does micro history, so I'm not going to talk to you all night about this stuff, okay? Our final honoree this evening, Barbara G. Novick, co-founded BlackRock and is currently serving as their senior advisor. Thank you. From its inception up until 2008, Barbara headed the global client group. Basically, she was running it all for both institutional and individual clients. In 2009, she established BlackRock's global public policy group to give investors a voice and subsequently oversaw their investment stewardship team. Barbara's intellect, decency, and commitment to excellence has shaped BlackRock from its inception. Her hard-headed competence and conscience firmly established the priorities of long-term value within the firm's culture and, even more surprising, position the fulfillment of their long-term value in the optimum functioning of our society as a whole. Simply put, a company has no long-term value in a sick society. Not unlike my favorite business philosopher, Peter Drucker, Barbara essentially put into place with a now staggering $10 trillion in assets under management what he envisioned. As he wrote, economic purpose does not mean that the corporation should be free from social obligations. On the contrary, it should be so organized as to fulfill those obligations in the very act of seeking its own self-interest. Strong words. That also explains why Barbara is so dedicated to the professional development of women in finance and to financial and economic literacy, and why she seems to serve on something like 5,000 boards. All right, maybe not that many, but Barbara, thanks for joining us tonight. So I get to sit down now and ask these fabulous people some questions. I want to start off maybe with Claudia. When I asked her what she wanted to talk about, she said dogs. And I just got a dog. And it ended up, they told us it was a 2-year-old mutt, and it ended up being a 1-year-old purebred Labrador. And the reason was because they're apparently giving dogs back now after coming out of the pandemic. We couldn't get one during the pandemic, and now they called us a couple times with different dogs that they had. But I don't know if you really want to talk about dogs so much. You want to talk about dogs?
No, but we don't say mutt. We say random breed.
Random breed.
And if it was deliberate, we say mixed breed. But we don't use words like mongrel or mutt.
Because you'll offend the dog? Who are you trying to save from the language?
Humanity.
Well, how's that going? The saving humanity thing?
I don't know. I work on dogs.
Because you can have some possibility of success, right? Let me ask you, because you told me before we came on that you have been doing some work about women's experience during the pandemic.
Right.
And I guess I knew very well one of your colleagues in this world, Alan Kruger. And he did an awful lot of fabulous micro work that had tremendous implications for the macroeconomy, I think, or for the broader economy and how things were structured. So tell me what you found at looking at women's experience during the pandemic and what we ought to be fixing that you found.
Okay, a couple of things. Number one, the reason that women were so important in this pandemic, more important than at any time in U.S. history, is because we are 47% of the labor force. Previously, we weren't, and therefore, that thing that we do, that we know from data and from everyday lives that we do more than anyone else, is this thing called caregiving. And the one thing that collapsed big time in March of 2020 was schools and elder care. And women are 47% of the labor force. They're also doing all that caregiving. It was pretty clear that the macro and the micro were colliding. And so therefore, the way out was to do something about caregiving. And we sort of failed on that. And that's one of the things that we do have to, and I'll use the phrase, build back better.
I did a story about the lack of immigration visas, which is not germane to anything you just said, except for after I tell you the following. One of the ways that people do caregiving in this country is through au pairs. And there are something like 17,000 or 20,000 au pairs that come in through the visa program. Those visas could not be given, so therefore the people for whom relying on on child care couldn't go to work, and the whole thing snowballed. And I love what you said about the macro and the micro colliding.
Yeah, but most of the caregiving was not the au pairs.
Right.
Most of the caregiving was the public schools.
Right.
That's the lion's share of it, is the 5 to 17-year-olds, right? Not the little kids.
Barbara, I want to come back to one of the themes that was in the intro section here, which is the idea of teaching girls economics. And I know we lose girls. I think there's still girls when we lose them in the math and the sciences. And we've been talking about this for a very long time, not you and I, but I think as a group, are we making any progress in that regard?
So let's put it in historical context. 40 years ago when I started my career, there were no senior women, certainly not at the firm I was at and not at most of the firms that I looked around at. Today, if you're a female managing director at any kind of financial services firm, just raise your hand.
Right on.
That's just this room, okay? So you multiply that out. There are role models today. There are numbers that I couldn't even have dreamt of when I was a young person looking ahead saying, gee, where are all the senior women? They don't exist. So I think that alone is a game changer. Are we doing better? Yes, we're making progress. Are we making enough progress fast enough? Probably not. Can CE help? Absolutely. Nan? Absolutely.
Thasunda, I'm going to ask you a very complicated question here. I want you to be a priest and absolve me of my guilt. Just listen. When Lisa Cook was appointed to the Federal Reserve, or nominated to the Federal Reserve by President Biden, I went on air to announce her nomination. I did not say she was the first black woman. I felt like I was giving her more honor for being who she was and being nominated, rather than saying she was the first black woman to be nominated. Which is the right call here?
Well, both things are true. And I think acknowledging that she's black should not make anyone feel less than, because it is a difference recognizing that there's not enough black women in very senior roles. And so I do agree that you first want people to understand that she is who she is.
An economist, and a damn good economist, and a worthy economist.
But I also think, for me at least, I am one of the first black women. And I think it's okay to say that, because I hope to not make it a period. I want to see the second, the third, the fourth, and the fifth. And so I think if you don't acknowledge that and you just say someone is an economist, and you don't acknowledge that as a black woman, to accomplish that, people are watching, and hopefully people can then see themselves in that, because when you said a black woman, it matters. And I know for me, when people say you're one of the first black women, there's only been 3 to ever run a Fortune 500. Mm-hmm. I don't think being a black woman is less than. I don't think it diminishes my qualifications. In fact, I think it has been an accelerator in understanding who's not in the room, and the art of possibility to make sure that there's more people that look like me and people that have not yet been realized to lead companies. So that's how I think about it.
So are we, God, this is not where I thought this conversation was going to go. And you kind of, Claudia, I don't know if you're the right person to answer this question, but are we looking for the world where we always want to acknowledge what Thasunda was talking about, or is it a better world when there are so many black women appointed to the Federal Reserve Board, and so many black women who were considered and nominated to the Supreme Court, that there's no reason to report that part of the story?
I think you answered your own question.
Yes. That is the goal.
I have 2 rules, which is, one is never work on a story your editor knows anything about. And the second is try not to be on set with people who know the answers to questions better than you do.
So can I suggest
Go ahead, please, Barbara.
a way you report that story? You first talk about the person's qualifications. Someone can see she's a woman. Someone can see she's black. But when you lead with that, it implies that's why she was picked.
That's what I hated about all the other stories that I read. That's why I didn't do it, because I read that. Everybody's like, Lisa Cook, the first black woman. And so I just said, I'm leaving that out. Nobody called me on it, and my editors didn't notice it. What do you think, Robert? Robert Feck from CNBC. I didn't notice. You didn't notice, but Would you have done it?
No, I think for our audience, the qualifications always come first.
Right. And then, Barbara, you think, then follow up, she's the first.
You could follow it,
Yeah.
but I think you lead with, she's qualified, and here's why she's qualified.
That's what bugged me was when I saw that everybody was leading with it, I'm like, that's her qualification. No, it's not her
Well,
qualification.
wouldn't we just assume that she had to be qualified? Why do we have to acknowledge qualifications? That's a given.
Because that's how they talk about the guys.
I'm going to disagree with you there. Did you notice some of the nominations of the prior administration?
Not by
Not
black women.
everybody rose to that standard, Thasunda.
Right, but the way they talk about the guys, they never say he's
Exactly.
the first guy.
Fair
They
enough.
say
Right,
he's an
exactly.
accomplished economist.
Let me move on from this. Thasunda, you are obviously watching what's happening in markets these days, and I think people are quite interested in this. This is, for me personally, one of the more challenging times to think about and report the economy. We have an economy that's recovering, coming back from COVID, returning to normal were some of the words that we used tonight in the introduction. At the same time, we have an economy with raging inflation and a Federal Reserve that just today laid out one of the more aggressive tightening plans that we've ever seen, at least since 1994 and maybe earlier than that. How do you square it all? What do you think about where we're going and what the outlook is?
Great.
Well, if you don't answer it, I have to, so.
Exactly. Well, you're going to answer it anyway, I'm sure. But no, I mean, I think a couple of things. We should expect a lot of volatility. I mean, when you look at the rise of inflation, that is impacting people. You know, when you think about the average person is spending close to $300, $3,300 a year in terms of the cost going up. You see that the balance sheets overall are pretty healthy when you think about the funding, the stimulus. But the reality is that's eroding. People have been in their homes. They want to get out. They want to travel, but it's costing more. I think when you think about, well, where does this lead us and where are we going? I think we have to buckle up. I think that the average American is going to have to make a different set of choices, but I hope that listening to the kids, that they stay invested. I hope that they stay contributing to their retirement plans. I hope that they make a different set of trade-offs and not take money out of their long-term retirement or take money out, you know, on things that can cause long-term implications when you think about getting past this storm. So a lot of volatility, rates are going to continue to rise, inflation will continue to be an issue. We have not fully recovered from the pandemic. We're still in the pandemic. We have global, you know, everything going on a geopolitical stage. But this too shall pass, and we've seen, you know, a lot of market volatility in the past, and so I believe that we'll get through it. But I think there will be, you know, a lot of uncertainty over the next several quarters.
Barbara, do you want to attack that question?
Well, I think the big one is energy, right? So what is the price of gas? If you go to the pump here, it's $4+. You go in California, it's $5 and almost $6. You know, that affects lots of people in different ways, and at the bottom end of the socioeconomic spectrum, it affects them even more. These are people who, you know, they have to drive an hour plus to get to their job. Well, that just cost them $100 to fill their tank. So I think that the pain that people are going to feel is going to be very real. I think it is going to have political implications, not just for the, you know, not just market implications. I think we're going to see a lot of volatility, a lot of dissatisfaction.
Claudia, one of the things happening right now in the economy that I think falls into your area of expertise is wages are not keeping pace with inflation.
That's right.
And they had not previously kept pace with productivity, right? Which is, there's this long-standing idea that workers are supposed to get the bulk of the dollars increase in productivity. And for many years before, they had not been doing that. And now they're getting messed up on the other side.
So there are two things going on. You started with one and you ended with another. So the first one has to do with expectations that we haven't had inflation in a very long time. And therefore, wage contracts and wage expectations on the part of those who set wages in firms aren't geared to that, and they're going to have to start getting geared to that really soon. That's the issue. The second point that you made is different. It has to do with long-term trends in labor share of the total. But I think what you really want to talk about is this issue with changing expectations. We have lived for a very long time with very, very low levels of price increases. And suddenly we have this huge price increase. Whether I want to call it inflation, everyone calls it inflation. I'm a student of Milton Friedman. Inflation is a rate of change. I'm not quite certain that this is a rate of change versus a jump. But whatever it is, firms are going to have to increase wages soon.
So this is a fascinating point, and I'm going to put a little economic ease on what you said, which is you're talking about reaching a new equilibrium level. Is that what you mean by a jump, rather than a consistent move up where it goes up more every year?
The definition of inflation is delta P over delta T. It's a change. It's a change per unit time, okay? Whereas a price change is just one change of prices.
But,
okay?
and that's to get used to.
I'm just being a stickler here.
No, fair enough. I actually think
But
that's...
it really is important, because if we think it's inflation, then we build it into our expectations. We build it into expectations of everything, including interest rates. Yeah.
I think that's really important, because one of the things we learned picking up on what you were talking about earlier is we've had this decline in the workforce. There are fewer workers out there because of early retirement, because of a decline of immigration, because of child care issues. And so we do have to get to some form of a new equilibrium level of the wage relative to the supply out there. And I don't know, Thasunda, maybe you want to talk about that.
Can I just correct
Please.
something? The labor force participation rate of 25 to 54 years old is back today where it was in February of 2020, when it was at one of the highest for women, okay? So in fact, the labor force, at least for that group, has not collapsed.
She said it all.
Sorry.
But we're still down a couple million workers.
We're still down some amount, but not of that much. Remember, I stopped at 54. The older group really has decreased.
Right, they've had an increased excess retirement is what we've had. And so my question to Thasunda is whether or not you feel like we've reached the new equilibrium at wage rate here, or in terms of finding workers at a certain level, or is the wage rate still going up?
Well, wages are going up. Whether or not it's reached the equilibrium, I'll let you, the expert, comment on that. But what we are seeing is that you are paying more to attract talent. You're seeing it across all categories. So you're seeing it in cyber. You're seeing it with new students coming out of school and what you're paying in terms of the starting wage. You're seeing, which I think is good, the entry-level wages are increasing, which I think is really important when you think about having that living wage across the country. And so you are seeing the wages. The question is going to be with the rise, I don't want to say inflation, the jump, in terms of what things are costing every day. Those wages are not necessarily enough, particularly in that middle to lower tranche, to offset the rise in cost of energy and basic needs that people are experiencing.
Barbara, did you want to talk about that?
So in the last year, my husband and I, for whatever reasons, we managed to travel through, I think it was 20 different states. And the thing that was really shocking was everywhere there is a help wanted sign.
Yes.
Every restaurant, every convenience store, everywhere you go on Main Street, every store has help wanted. And then you start talking to the local people. And they say the cost of living is more than they could possibly afford at an entry-level wage. So what's the real minimum wage in the country? It's gone up even beyond anyone's wildest expectations of what they would have wanted it to be. There was one town where they said, if you don't offer $25 an hour, you don't even get someone to show up for the interview. So we can call it inflation, we can call it jumps in prices, but there's a tremendous pressure when you see the cost of living in a lot of places, and not just cities. Sometimes it's just a more resort town or things like that. There are a lot of hot markets that people cannot afford to live, and that's going to put more and more pressure on wages.
I mean, it's a big deal that people moved out to these outlying areas, and then they started going to the restaurants at these outlying areas and wondered why none of the people who worked in the restaurants in the places they used to live are now out there living in the new towns that they're living in, because there's nowhere for them to live. Let me ask you if you're confident in the Federal Reserve's ability to handle inflation. And you can speak to Loretta Mester, who's right out somewhere over there.
I think the Federal Reserve has a big challenge. I was personally disappointed when they used the word transitory or temporary or whatever. Like, it was so obvious, I thought, that this was a real problem, and this was a growing problem, and it was accelerating, and yet they weren't really addressing it. They changed, they pivoted, and I think now there's much more focus. Can they fix it? I think it's a big problem. I think it's going to take a year or two to really be able to answer, were they successful? There's a lot of factors outside of the United States that they don't have control of, like a war in Europe, which clearly puts pressure on the energy prices. So ask again in 2 years.
Professor, do you want to tackle that question?
I want us to realize that this is a pretty amazing economy. When I sort of woke up one morning in March of 2020 and realized that I was going to get calls from the press as an economic historian about how unemployment was going to look relative to the Great Depression, 1930s. I remember that day when the jobs report, the first one came out, and I was so nervous, and I was going over the numbers from the Great Depression, double digit, where the first digit was a 2. Was I going to see that? And we didn't. We saw something that looked pretty darn bad, and it looked worse for people in some sectors than in others, particularly those in retail and personal services at the time, in construction and manufacturing, less so later. But when I think about what we've done over the past 2 years, and a lot of it was because we really did put a lot of money in the hands of people who really needed it. We really did reduce child poverty. That's pretty amazing. I think we came back, we used technology to work at home, many of us who could. We're using technology so that we don't have to commute to work. We're learning something. We have done something in a coordinated way that we could have done before, but we didn't. I am impressed. There are lots of things that we can do a lot better. For example, we lost lots of community college students who we want to bring back. There are lots of people who are still lost, but far, far, far fewer than anyone would have imagined 2 years ago.
Sure.
I have to call you every morning before I go on TV. God, I need that kind of perspective. I was actually just thinking about that. It's really the all-in thing we want. And the other side of that's the counterfactual of what would have happened if we hadn't done it. And yeah, it's going to be tough getting out. But if we hadn't gotten in, what would have been the result? I think you just answered that in a really beautiful and interesting way. Thasunda, do you want to follow up on that in terms of, are you...
He wants to do this.
Talk about raising the bar. But are you optimistic of the next couple of years? Are you concerned about a recession?
I have to be optimistic. And I say that similar to what you said. I mean, I think you have to look at the resiliency and confidence, I think, in some of the decisions that we'll know in 2 years how it all plays out. But I am optimistic. And again, it doesn't mean that it's going to be a straight line. It doesn't mean that we're not going to still have challenges. We don't know the real impact of the war and what that will really mean here in the States. But I am optimistic. I am.
Barbara, I want to come back to you on that question of the outlook. One interesting idea that's been out there, pardon me, is we've been through a period of optimizing supply chains for efficiency. and now we may be doing so for security, and that we may not be having the lowest cost good coming into it as an input into our system, but a more secure source of that. And this idea has been broadened into the idea of a deglobalization. Is that something that you see as a real trend? Is it something that concerns you?
So that's a real trend, right? That started when people realized they couldn't get their hands on PPE. And where did it come from? And how could we not have our own supply? And then it's broadened. And now with the war, I think people are realizing throughout Europe, their supply chains are very dependent country to country to country. So it's the region, cross regions, cross countries, and the reaction of many people, the public sector as well as the private sector, is to then try to insource. So we've gone through 20 plus years of outsourcing and globalization, and maybe the pendulum swung a little too far, maybe it'll come back. I don't know that it's necessarily a bad thing. It's different. It probably will raise some costs, but some of the things that were said about technology have also lowered costs, right? So you have to look at that whole picture. I'd like to say one thing about technology. One of the things that we saw is for some categories, people can work from home. And that's a real game changer. It's a game changer for getting talent from all different places, right? You could work pick a city, and your company can be in a different place, and that's okay now. That means you open up labor markets, and it changes how you think about it if you're hiring people. Or if somebody relocates, there's no longer needs to be the trailing spouse that you have to find a job for. That trailing spouse, they can continue to do their job. So I think there's a lot of things about labor in the United States that we're going to have to rethink to reflect the technology that's available today that didn't exist 25 years ago.
I have one last question. Is that okay, Nan? Professor, I spent 6 years in Russia from 92 to 98, and that's where I learned economics when I went to work in the morning and a Snickers bar was 25 rubles, and I'd come home in the afternoon and it was 50 rubles.
That's a price jump.
Good way to...
That's a jump.
If
That's a
jump. The question is the real cost, right? I was naive. I was in my 20s and I was naive in the early 90s when I thought the connection of Russia through capital and trade and exchange was going to save the world. And there's another period that we went through, which was 1913, if I'm not mistaken, when in fact global trade was greater as a percentage of global GDP than it is even now. Do you still are you so optimistic about the idea of these things with this combination of technology and trade to create some foundation for peace in this world? Or are you more pessimistic now after what's happened in Ukraine?
I think I'm most pessimistic about what's happening in Hungary and in Serbia. Those places actually voted in someone.
Do you think we were...
And that's, this sort of brings us to think harder about what Madeleine Albright wrote about in The Many Faces of Fascism. She said to us, don't look at what happened, don't look at Hitler and Mussolini and think that your fascism is going to look like that. It's going to be different. And she was right.
Do you think, though, there's some role, a greater role, or was it misplaced to have that optimism and the ability of business and trade and economic connections to keep peace?
Big question. In '92, when my colleague Andre Schleifer and others, young people went to this place that was once the Soviet Union and helped to privatize it, we were, very optimistic, just as you were. Yeah.
I knew Andre.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, hopefully you still know him.
Yeah. I want to help, please join me in thanking the panelists. Thank you all very much.
I just want to say, Mike,
How long have I
wanna-
been doing this that I get up? And-
I get one more minute. I just wanted to thank you all again for your generosity, for coming out and being here in person. To my staff, the board, everybody who showed up again for us this year after 2.5 years of not seeing you all. I want to thank our truly amazing honorees tonight, the teachers and the students. And I want to thank Steve for bringing his good humor and cheer. It's so much more fun when we can do this together. And also for being our diversity candidate tonight during the fireside chat.
Because I'm bald.
Exactly. But he brings so much to the evening for us and to the students all year round. So we will see you next spring. Hopefully some of you will be joining us for the Econ and Personal Finance Challenges. Thank you all again and have a lovely evening.